The wind carried a dry whistle across the desert, the kind of sound that made a person feel small beneath the weight of the wide American sky. The land stretched endless, a sea of sand and scattered sagebrush, broken only by the jagged ridges of stone rising like teeth on the horizon. In such a place, life clung to the edges of hardship. Villages stood as testaments to endurance, their people bound by ancient rules that cared little for kindness and more for survival. It was a world where the fertile were prized and the barren bore the heavy hand of judgment. She had known this day was coming, though she had prayed in silence for a different fate. The whispers had grown in the village, carried from fire pit to fire pit, slipping like poison into the ears of elders and husbands alike. Her womb had not yielded children, and in their eyes, a woman without children was a vessel unworthy of keeping. She was not judged for the food she cooked, the water she carried, or the care she gave. She was judged for what her body had not given. That morning the decision was sealed. When they dragged her from the lodge, the sun was still low, its rays spilling gold across the earth. She did not fight. What would resistance change? Her arms were bound, her voice ignored. Women stood silently as men muttered about old laws, laws carved in memory older than her own birth. To them, her body was a reminder of shame, a curse that would weigh upon their tribe if left unpunished. There were no trials, no words spoken in her defense. There was only the march to the edge of the barren plain. The ground there was hard and cracked, baked under countless summers, was a place of final lessons, where those who had broken their people's trust were left for the earth to claim. The hole was waiting, dug deep enough that only her head would remain above ground. The sight of it made her chest tighten, yet she did not cry out. To cry would be to grant them satisfaction. To beg would be to lower herself further than they already had. They lowered her into the pit, scooping the dirt back over her body, pressing it down until her chest and shoulders could no longer rise freely with her breath. A dust filled her mouth, clung to her lashes. The sun rose higher, hot and merciless, its light striking her face as though to burn away what little strength remained. Around her, the villagers stood in silence. Not one pair of eyes held pity. When the last shovelful of earth fell, they turned and left, their figures shrinking against the vast desert until she was alone with nothing but wind and sky. Hours passed like years. Her throat cracked with thirst. Her mind drifted between memory and despair. She thought of the nights she had listened to coyotes howl beyond the camp, and wondered if those same voices would soon circle her, waiting for weakness. She thought of the stars that would come with night, cold companions above a body that would grow still beneath the soil. She thought of her worth, whether it had truly been so little that her life was worth less than silence. The desert was cruel, but it was not empty. There were eyes that watched from beyond the stone ridges. Eyes trained to notice the smallest shift of wind against dust, the faintest sound carried on air. He had been riding alone, his pony trailing slowly, when he saw the strange stillness of a head above the plain. At first, he thought it a trick of light, but as he drew closer, he saw the truth. It was a woman, her skin darkened by sun, her lips cracked, her eyes glazed with pain. He dismounted with caution, scanning the horizon. To approach without care was to invite danger, for men sometimes used bait to lure the unsuspecting. Yet the sight before him bore no falsehood. She was buried, left to die by her own, knelt, brushing the dirt near her neck, and her eyes flicked weakly toward him. In them he saw both fear and a flicker of hope. She tried to speak, but no sound came. He did not ask questions. His hands, strong and calloused from years of riding and hunting, clawed at the earth with speed. The dirt gave way reluctantly, heavy and clinging. The sun beat down on his back, sweat soaking through the fringed leather that clung to his shoulders. His breath came rough, but he did not stop. Inch by inch, he freed her chest, her arms, her waist. At last he pulled her from the hole, her body trembling like a reed bent by too many storms. For a long moment, she lay against the ground, the taste of freedom mixing with the grit of sand in her mouth. She blinked against the light, her lashes heavy. She expected him to leave her there, as so many had done before. Yet he did not. Lifted her gently, his arms steady, as though she weighed nothing at all. Her head rested against his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart. A stranger's heart, yet one that had chosen mercy, when her own people had chosen abandonment. He carried her toward his pony, whispering to the animal in a tongue shaped by the mountains and rivers of his people. She could not understand the words, but she felt their calm strength. The warrior moved with the ease of one born to the land, his steps sure, even on the cracked plain. He placed her across the pony's back, then swung up behind her, holding her steady with one arm. As the pony moved forward, the horizon stretched before them, painted in shades of fire and dust. The village behind her was gone, its people lost to her forever. Ahead lay only uncertainty, a path carved by the will of a man she did not know. Yet something in his presence told her she had not been saved for nothing. There was purpose in his act, though she could not yet see what shape it would take. Her lips parted, a whisper barely carried by the wind. She wanted to ask him why he had stopped, why he had chosen to dig where others had chosen to turn their backs. But her voice failed her. He glanced down at her, eyes dark and steady, then looked ahead again without speaking. His silence was not coldness. It was something else, something older, as if words were too small to carry what he carried. The desert swallowed their tracks as quickly as they made them, leaving no sign of where they had come from or where they were headed. Shadows grew long, the heat of the day easing into the cool breath of evening, yet with the night would come new dangers: wolves, snakes, the eyes of men who hunted both prey and people. She wondered what fate awaited her in the home of a stranger, in a world far from the one she had known. And as the first star pierced the twilight sky, she realized that her story had not ended in the hole her people had left for her. It had only begun, carried now by the strength of a warrior whose reasons were still locked in silence. The night was rising around them, and with it, the promise of trials yet to come. Would he protect her, or had she only traded one fate for another she did not yet understand? The answer lay somewhere ahead, waiting beyond the dark ridges of the land. The desert night pressed close around them, the stars above glittering cold and sharp like blades set against the dark. The woman leaned weakly against the warrior's chest, her body still shaking from the long hours she had spent buried in the earth. Each step of the pony rocked her, and though her strength had been nearly stolen by sun and thirst, her mind refused to give in to sleep. Questions burned within her. Why had he chosen to help her when her own kin had left her to die? What did he see in her, a woman whom others had declared worthless? The warrior did not speak much, but his silence was not harsh. It seemed shaped by discipline, as though he carried the weight of many years and had learned that words were precious, best used sparingly. His eyes moved constantly across the land, scanning the ridges and shadows with the instinct of one who had survived both man and beast. She realized he was not merely taking her from the place of her death. He was guiding her deeper into his world, a world she knew nothing about. As the night grew colder, he finally stopped. They came upon a small hollow carved into the rock, sheltered from the biting wind. There he lowered her gently to the ground and wrapped a deerskin around her shoulders. The simple gesture made her chest ache. No one had shown her such care in many seasons. When he handed her a waterskin, she drank greedily, the cool liquid burning down her parched throat. He did not rush her, only watched with the quiet patience of one who had seen hunger and thirst before. Her voice came ragged at first when she tried to speak. She wanted to thank him, yet the words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered something small, her tone trembling, but his eyes softened at the sound. Answered in his own language, the meaning unclear to her ears, yet his voice carried reassurance. Though she could not understand his words, she could feel his intent. As dawn approached, the sky turned pale, washing the land in gray before the sun returned with its fire. The warrior lifted her once more onto the pony, and they rode until the desert gave way to foothills lined with juniper and pine. The air was different here, cooler and touched by the scent of resin. Birds flitted between branches, their calls breaking the silence of stone. To her it felt like entering another world, one hidden away from the cruelty she had known. On the second evening, they reached a settlement, tucked deep into the mountains. It was not large, but it was alive with movement, children running barefoot near the lodges. Smoke curling from fires, women grinding maize while men prepared bows and horses. When the warrior entered with her, the people stopped to stare. Their eyes followed every step, some curious, others wary. She could feel the weight of their judgment, though it was different from the stares of her own people. Here it was not contempt, it was caution, as though they were measuring whether she belonged among them. The warrior spoke to the elders, his voice low but steady. She could not understand the words, yet she knew he was telling them how he had found her. The elders' faces showed no surprise, only the slow, deliberate thought of men used to carrying the responsibility of their people. They nodded, though some exchanged looks that carried hidden meaning. Whatever was decided, she was taken into a small lodge near the edge of the camp, where she was given food and a place to rest. That night, she lay awake listening to the sounds of this new world, the crackle of fires, the murmur of voices outside, the rhythm of drums somewhere deeper in the village. Her heart still carried fear, for she was a stranger among strangers. Yet she also felt something she had not known in years, the faint stir of hope. Perhaps her story was not finished after all. In the days that followed, she began to see more of the man who had saved her. He moved among his people with quiet authority, though he never sought attention. Children followed him, eager for his approval, and hunters listened when he spoke. He seemed respected, though there was a sadness about him, a heaviness he carried as though his spirit bore scars the body could not show. She wondered what had shaped him, what losses or battles had carved that silence into his soul. Slowly, her strength returned. The women of the village, though distant at first, began to show her small kindnesses, sharing food, teaching her simple words in their tongue. She learned to grind maize alongside them, to gather herbs from the rocky hills, to carry water from the streams. Still, the shadow of her past clung to her. In quiet moments, she remembered the faces of those who had turned from her, their cold eyes as they left her to the sun and earth. Those memories did not fade easily. Yet each time she saw the warrior, each time his gaze met hers, she felt a shift within her. He had not asked who she was or what her people had done to her. He had not judged, only seen her buried and chosen to act. That choice alone had given her more worth than she had been granted in years. But she could not understand why. What debt did he owe her? A stranger? What promise had bound him to take her into his home and risk the judgment of his own people? The mystery lingered like a storm on the horizon, pulling her thoughts back to him again and again. She longed to ask, but the barrier of language kept her silence. Instead, she watched him from afar, watched how he tended his horse with care, how he stood alone on the ridges at dusk as though speaking to ghosts, how he carried himself with both strength and sorrow. As weeks passed, the villagers grew less wary of her presence, though not all trusted her. Some whispered that she was a burden, that a woman without children could bring no blessing to their people. The words stung, echoing too closely the judgment of her old life. Yet she noticed something different here. Though the whispers came, no one sought to bury her. No hole was dug, no soil pressed over her chest. In this place, her existence was not erased. That difference alone gave her reason to endure. Still, the fear remained. She knew that survival in this land was never secure. Raiders passed through the valleys, soldiers from distant forts sometimes brought war, and hunger could ride in with winter. Every day was a test, and she wondered whether her presence would become a burden too heavy to carry. The warrior's actions kept her questions alive. One evening, when the firelight flickered long shadows on the lodge walls, he finally spoke to her in halting words she could almost understand. He told her of his people's belief that every life left abandoned by cruelty was a spirit calling out, and to answer that call was to honor the land itself. She was such a spirit, he said, left to die, yet refusing to surrender. His voice was rough, but his eyes carried something steadier than pity. That night, she lay awake again, her thoughts tangled with wonder and unease. Was she truly meant to be here, saved not by accident but by some greater design? Or was she only caught in the path of a man whose heart carried burdens of his own? The mystery of his silence, the weight of her past, and the uncertain future stretched before her, like the endless horizon of the desert. Though she had escaped one death, she knew another, waited if she could not prove herself worthy in this new world. The question of how lingered, pressing on her chest each morning when she woke to another day among strangers. And while the village settled into its rhythms, while fires burned and drums beat their steady song, she knew the tension had not lifted. It had only deepened, drawing her forward toward a fate she could not yet see. The desert had not finished with her, and neither had the warrior whose strong hands had pulled her from the earth. The days turned into weeks. And though the woman grew stronger, she could feel that her place in the warriors' village was far from certain. Each morning, when she stepped outside the small lodge given to her, she felt the eyes of others follow her movements. Some were curious, some indifferent, but a few held distrust sharp enough to cut. She had seen it before in the faces of her own people. Once a judgment takes root, it does not icily fade. The warrior remained her only shield. His quiet presence commanded respect among his people, but even he could not silence every whisper. There were questions about why he had brought her back, why he had chosen to take in a woman abandoned by her tribe. Some muttered that spirits marked her as cursed, that to carry her into their lives was to invite misfortune, yet he never turned away from her. Each day he gave her small tasks, gathering wood, fetching water, helping the women grind maize. Slowly, she learned their ways, though she still carried the fear that one mistake would see her cast out again. Her nights were restless. The image of the pit haunted her dreams, the sensation of earth pressing tight against her chest. She woke, gasping, sweat chilling her skin, only to see the dim glow of the lodge fire and hear the breathing of the people around her. In those moments she wondered if she was truly alive or if she was still beneath the soil, trapped in a dream that stretched endlessly. But each time, the thought of the warrior's strong hands pulling her free anchored her back to the present. The main conflict was not only within her, as the village itself was caught between old ways and new dangers. Raiders had been spotted in the valleys, men who came swift on horseback to steal cattle, food, and sometimes women. Word spread that soldiers from the distant forts were pushing deeper into Apache lands, building roads and cutting forests. The people spoke in low tones of battles past, of blood spilled to keep their way of life. Tension simmered like fire under ash, waiting for a spark. The warrior seemed to carry that weight more than most. At dusk, he often stood on the ridges, scanning the horizon as if expecting riders to appear. His silence was heavy with thought, though he rarely shared it. The woman watched him, feeling the pull of his quiet strength, yet also the distance that seemed to separate him from everyone else. There was something unspoken in him, a burden she longed to understand. One evening, while she helped gather herbs with an elder woman, she overheard part of his story. The elder spoke softly, almost reluctantly, as if she should not share what she knew. The warrior had once had a family of his own, a wife and a child born too soon, both lost in the hunger of a harsh winter. Since then, he had lived with a silence that no drum or song could break. He fought for his people, hunted for them, but his heart had remained apart, bound by grief. Hearing this, the woman understood his sadness in a new light. He had saved her not only out of duty, but because something in her suffering mirrored his own loss. Yet this knowledge unsettled her. Was she a shadow of what he had lost, a reminder he could not bury? Or was she something else, a chance to heal wounds that had scarred too deeply? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and though she wanted to ask him, the words remained locked inside her. At the same time, another conflict stirred in the village. Among the younger warriors was one who had little patience for her presence. He saw her as weak, a burden taken in by a man who should know better. His glares grew sharper each time their paths crossed. Once, while she carried water from the stream, he blocked her path and spoke words she did not understand, but his tone left no doubt of his contempt. When she tried to pass, he shoved the bucket, spilling it into the dirt. She froze, her chest tightening with the same helplessness she had known before. "Door!" But before the confrontation could grow, the warrior appeared, his voice cutting through the air with quiet authority. The younger man stepped back, anger still in his eyes, but he did not challenge further. This small clash did not ease her fears. She knew the warrior's protection could not shield her from everything. If more came to resent her, what then? Would she once again be left behind? Or worse, cast out into a world where survival was a question of luck? Her struggle to belong grew heavier when she realized she was being tested. The elders asked her to help tend to the children, to carry heavier loads, to learn their stories and songs. These tasks were not cruel, but they carried weight. She understood that they wanted to see if she could be useful, if she could give back to the people rather than simply take their food and shelter. She tried with all her strength, though her body was not as strong as theirs, and her knowledge was thin. Each night she fell into sleep exhausted, her hands blistered, her back aching. Yet the next morning she rose again, determined not to fail. In the midst of this, Another subplot began to weave itself. A child from the village, a curious boy with quick hands and quicker laughter, began to follow her. He watched how she worked, mimicking her actions, and often brought her small gift-smooth stones, feathers, wildflowers. His presence was a light in her days, reminding her that not all judged her harshly. Through him, she began to learn more of the language, picking up simple words that allowed her to understand and be understood. In his innocence, she found a kind of acceptance she had thought lost to her forever. But with light came shadow. Raiders struck a nearby settlement, leaving behind smoke and sorrow. The news reached the village quickly, and fear spread. Men sharpened weapons, women gathered food in secret, preparing for the possibility that danger might soon come to them. The woman felt the tension like a storm pressing close. She knew that if the raiders came, her place in this village would matter even less. In the chaos of survival, she could be abandoned again. The warrior grew more distant during this time. His eyes hardened, his movements sharpened, as though he were preparing himself for battle. She longed to speak to him, to remind him of the mercy he had shown her, but he seemed unreachable, locked in a world of strategy and unspoken fears. Still, when his gaze met hers across the firelight, she felt that he had not forgotten. There was something unbroken between them, though neither had yet given it voice. As the days edged closer to winter, food grew scarce, and the village tightened its belts. She joined the women in foraging, digging roots beneath the frost, gathering pine nuts and herbs. The work was grueling, yet she welcomed it, for it kept her hands busy and her mind away from the fears circling her heart. But one evening, returning late with a bundle of wood, she caught sight of shadows moving near the ridge. Not the familiar silhouettes of hunters or children, but figures cloaked in distance, watching. She froze, her pulse quickening. When she turned to call out, the shadows melted into the night. She told no one at first, unsure if her eyes had played tricks on her. Yet the memory gnawed at her, and when she finally whispered it to the warrior, his expression turned grave. He did not dismiss her. Instead, he took it as warning, as proof that danger was closer than anyone wanted to admit. That night, he stood long at the edge of camp, spear in hand, his figure still as stone against the starry sky. The woman lay awake, staring at the low fire, knowing that the storm of conflict was drawing nearer. She had been buried once and dragged back to life by a man whose silence spoke more than words. But now the question pressed against her heart heavier than before. Could she prove herself strong enough to stand beside him when danger finally came? Or would she once again be seen as nothing more than a burden when survival demanded sacrifice? The answer had not yet revealed itself, but the shadows on the ridges promised it would come soon. The desert had spared her once, but its trials were far from over. The nights grew colder. The mountains seemed to press closer with every passing day. Smoke from the lodges curled thin and sharp into the gray sky, carrying with it the smell of pine and earth. The woman felt the tension in the air like a string pulled too tight. The whispers of raiders had turned into signs, and the shadows she had seen near the ridge were no longer just in her imagination. The people of the village walked with heavier steps, their eyes darting toward the horizon. She tried to steady herself with work, gathering wood, grinding grain, carrying water, anything that kept her hands from trembling, but her heart refused to be calm. She remembered the day she had been buried, the way the ground closed over her chest, and she feared she would once again be trapped only, this time by violence rather than earth. Every face in the camp seemed sharpened by fear, and though no one spoke openly to her about it, she could feel their doubts. Would she help them if danger came, or would she crumble under the weight of fear? The warrior kept his distance more often now, spending long hours beyond the village, scouting the ridges, watching the trails. When he returned, his silence was heavier than before. He spoke in low tones with the elders, his voice steady, his eyes dark with thought. She wished she could understand the words, but the language was still too new to her. All she could read was the tension in his face, the way his hand lingered near his spear, the way his shoulders stiffened. When the wind carried distant sounds, one evening the boy who often followed her came running, his breath quick, his eyes wide. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the edge of camp, pointing at the horizon where dust rose faint against the dying sun. Her chest tightened at the sight. Riders? Too many to count at first glance, but enough to send waves of fear through her veins. They were still far, but distance was no comfort. Distance could be swallowed quickly by hooves and anger. The village moved with urgency that night. Fires were doused to keep the smoke from betraying their position. The women gathered the children and hurried them into shelters hidden among the rocks. Men checked their weapons, sharpening blades, stringing bows, tightening the leather on their spears. The sound of it all, the scraping, the murmured prayers, the quiet cries of frightened children, settled like a storm cloud above them. The warrior came to her then, his face hard in the flicker of firelight. For the first time he spoke to her directly in words she could half understand. He told her she must stay close to the women and children, that she must not stray, that her strength would be needed in keeping them calm. If the men rode to fight, she wanted to argue, to tell him she was not helpless, but the weight in his voice stopped her. He was not only commanding, he was protecting. She nodded, though her heart burned with the need to do more. The next day passed in uneasy silence. No riders appeared, though the dust lingered on the horizon like a warning. Scouts returned with grim news. The raiders had set up camp not far from the valley. They were waiting, watching, choosing their moment. The uncertainty was worse than battle itself. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind, every coyote's howl made the people flinch. The woman found herself torn between dread and determination. She remembered too clearly the betrayal of her own tribe, the way they had left her for dead. She could not bear to be cast aside again. She wanted to prove her worth, not only to the warrior, but to herself. So while the women gathered supplies and comforted the children, she moved among them, lending her hands where she could, speaking what little words she had learned. Her efforts were small, but she saw the way some of the women began to look at her differently, not as a burden, but as one of them. Still, not all were convinced. The younger warrior, who had once shoved her water bucket, did not hide his disdain. He muttered sharp words whenever she passed, his tone dripping with scorn. To him, she was a weakness in their midst, a reminder that compassion could lead to ruin. His hostility grew sharper in the face of danger, and she feared that if the raiders attacked, he might turn his anger on her as easily as on the enemy. As days turned into a tense rhythm of waiting, the warrior finally returned one evening, with his face carved in stone. He gathered the elders and the strongest hunters. The air thickened as they spoke in hushed voices. Though she could not catch the words, she could feel the weight of them. Plans were being made, decisions that would decide the fate of the entire village. That night, she could not sleep. The fire in her lodge burned low, casting shadows that seemed to move with her thoughts. She listened to the breathing of those around her, to the faint howl of wind through the pines, and to the pounding of her own heart. She rose quietly and stepped outside, the cold air stinging her face. There on the ridge stood the warrior, silhouetted against the moon. His spear rested by his side, his gaze locked on the horizon where danger waited. She approached slowly, her steps crunching in the frost, until she stood near him. For a moment he did not turn, as though the land itself held him in place. Then his eyes met hers, and though no words passed between them, she felt the weight of his unspoken fears. She wanted to tell him she was not afraid, that she would not falter, that she would not be left behind again. But the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply stood beside him, her presence a silent vow. His hand shifted slightly, brushing hers for only a heartbeat before he pulled away. It was enough. The next morning, the tension broke. Scouts came running, their voices sharp with warning. The raiders were moving, their horses driving dust across the valley floor. The village erupted in motion, men grabbing weapons, women rushing the children into the shelters, elders calling for calm. The air was thick with the scent of fear and sweat, the sound of hooves growing louder, closer. The woman clutched the boy to her side as the first distant shouts echoed. She could see the warrior now, standing tall at the head of his people, his spear gleaming in the rising sun. His figure was steady, unshaken, as though carved from the very stone of the mountains. The sight of him stirred something fierce within her, a determination to endure whatever came, yet dread twisted inside her all the same. The raiders were many, and though the village was prepared, she knew blood would be spilled. Her place among these people, her worth, her very survival all hung in the balance of what would happen in the hours to come. The thunder of hooves rolled across the earth, shaking the ground beneath her feet. The warriors of the village raised their voices in cries that cut the air like arrows, the sound raw and unyielding. The women tightened their hold on the children, their prayers whispered quickly, their eyes wide. The woman stood among them, her heart hammering, her body trembling, yet her spirit refused to bend. The raiders appeared at last, a dark wave cresting the ridge, their shouts fierce, their weapons glinting. Dust billowed behind them, swallowing the horizon, erasing the line between earth and sky. For one breathless moment, all was still, the village, the women, the warrior standing ready. Then the clash began to rise, the moment before storm breaking. The woman's chest tightened as she gripped the boy's hand, her eyes locked on the warrior. In him, she saw both the weight of loss and the fire of defiance. Whatever came next, it would decide everything, not just for the village, but for her place in a world that had once declared her unworthy. The thunder grew louder, the air split with cries, and the ground shook as the storm of riders bore down on them. Suspense held her breath hostage. The moment of impact loomed like a blade drawn in silence. Waiting for the strike, the sound of hooves struck the earth like rolling thunder, each beat hammering closer until the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the raiders. Dust clouded the air, blinding the horizon, and the cries of men and horses clashed in the sharp morning wind. The woman held the boy tightly, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought it might tear free. She had known fear before, yet this was different. This was not the slow death of being buried under soil, but the raw, immediate terror of being swept away in chaos. The first arrows sliced the air, whistling past and striking shields and wood. The warriors of the village answered with cries that rose from deep in their chests, defiant and fierce. They met the charge, not with panic, but with a strength honed through years of surviving the harsh desert and mountains. The clash erupted at the edge of the village, where men and horses collided in a storm of dust, metal, and fire. From where she stood with the women and children, the woman could see the warrior at the front, his spear gleaming, his movements quick and certain. He fought like a man who carried not only skill, but a reason that burned within him. Each strike he delivered, each motion of his body was filled with precision. She could not hear his breath, but she felt the force of his will echo through the air. The boy clung to her, trembling, and she pulled him close, whispering the few words of comfort she had learned. Around her, the women prayed, some clutching amulets, others pressing their foreheads to the earth. The cries of battle filled the village, and though fear threatened to choke her, she refused to turn away. She had once been buried and left to die because others had seen her as worthless. Not now, not here. The raiders pressed hard, their numbers fierce. But the village fought with the strength of those defending their very lives. The warrior moved through the chaos like a flame, his voice rising to command, his presence steady, yet even he could not be everywhere at once. A break formed near the edge of the shelters, where a few raiders slipped past the defense. They came rushing toward the women, their shouts sharp, weapons raised. The women scattered, clutching the children, but the woman froze. Her body trembled, yet something in her heart would not allow her to run. The boy behind her cried out, and in that moment she felt a fire awaken. She grabbed a heavy branch from the woodpile and stood her ground. The raider's eyes widened in surprise at her defiance, but he did not stop. He swung down at her with his blade, and instinct drove her to lift the branch, blocking the strike. The force rattled through her bones, nearly knocking her to the ground, but she held firm. The clash caught the attention of others. One of the village women threw a stone that struck the raider's shoulder, distracting him long enough for the woman to swing again, this time striking hard against his side. He stumbled, and before he could recover, two warriors rushed in, spears flashing, driving him back into the dust. Her breath came ragged, her arms shaking, but she did not fall. The boy still clung to her, his eyes wide with awe, and she realized that for the first time she had not been helpless. She had faced the storm and stood her ground. The battle raged on, the air thick with dust and cries, but slowly the tide began to shift. The raiders, fierce as they were, had not expected such resistance. The village fought with unity, each warrior standing for the other, each woman and elder ready to defend what was theirs. The raiders pressed hard, but the land itself seemed to favor those who knew its every rock and shadow. One by one, the attackers faltered, their charge broken, their shouts turning to calls of retreat. When the last of them fled into the horizon, the village did not cheer. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fire. Dust settled slowly, revealing the toll left behind. Some men lay still, their lives given to defend their people. Others sat with wounds that would scar but not end them. The women moved swiftly, tending to the injured, gathering children, whispering thanks to the spirits. The woman stood among them, her chest heaving, her body sore. The boy clutched her hand, refusing to let go. Around her, people looked at her with new eyes. She saw not disdain, not suspicion, but recognition. They had seen her face danger without running. She had defended one of their children as though he were her own. That act alone had spoken louder than any words she could have offered. The warrior approached at last, his body marked with dust and blood, though his stance remained strong. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the world around them faded. There was no need for language. In his gaze she saw understanding, respect, and something deeper that she had not dared to hope for. He had saved her once from the earth itself, but now she had proven she was not a burden. She had saved herself, and in doing so, she had become part of something larger than her own survival. In the days that followed, the village mourned those they had lost and honored their memory with songs and fire. The wounded were tended with care, and the defenses of the village were strengthened. The threat of raiders had not vanished, but the people knew they could endure. The woman worked beside them, her hands no longer questioned, her presence no longer doubted. She was given tasks not out of pity but out of trust, and though her body grew weary each day, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The boy who had clung to her became her shadow, carrying her baskets, asking her to tell him stories in her halting mix of words. The women spoke to her more freely, teaching her songs, showing her the ways of their people. Even the younger warrior, who had once scorned her, offered a nod of acknowledgement, reluctant but real. Slowly, she had earned her place, not by pleading for it, but by standing when it mattered most. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, she walked to the ridge where the warrior often stood. He was there, as always, his eyes on the horizon. She stood beside him, the silence between them no longer heavy, but steady. Last she found her voice. She told him, in the simplest words she knew, that she was not afraid of the future, not as long as she could walk it beside those who had given her a home. He turned then, his gaze steady on hers, and though he spoke no grand words, the faint curve of his mouth and the warmth in his eyes told her everything she needed. He reached for her hand, not as a savior or protector, but as an equal. The stars began to appear overhead, the same stars she had once thought would be her only witnesses as she died in the earth. Now they shone on her in a new life, one carved from hardship, mercy, and strength she had not known she possessed. She understood then that her story was never about being buried or abandoned. It was about being pulled into the light, about finding a place where worth was not measured by what she could not give, but by the courage she carried. The village settled into its rhythms again, the sound of drums and laughter returning with time. Though danger still lurked beyond the ridges, the people stood ready, their hearts bound tighter by what they had endured together. And among them, the woman who had once been cast aside now walked with steady steps, her head high, her spirit unbroken. Her journey had begun in the shadow of death, but it had led her here, to a place where she was no longer buried but alive, not only in body, but in soul. And in the quiet strength of the warrior beside her, she found not just survival, but the promise of belonging. A promise stronger than fear, stronger than the desert, stronger than the past that had once tried to erase her.